Breaking news, Nikon has officially launched the Z6 and Z7 II, and people are really disappointed in it, even though they're exactly what we've been asking for, even though they're launching for less than the previous generation launched for. I'm going to really dig into this, and I'm also going to cover what this means for the company, as well as, of course, going over the specs and first impressions of it. This video is sponsored by us. I just wanted to plug our own educational material, as well as this t-shirt. Look at this awesome t-shirt, and this hat. Wow, who says my editing skills haven't gotten better? This is so much easier than getting a haircut. I can just cover my hair every day.
We have hats and shirts, but we also have masks. So you don't have to mask your enthusiasm for photography.
We also have a massive amount of educational materials, of course, covering the art and science of photography, with content like Stunning Digital Photography, the #1 photography book in the world. It's become largely a standard in high schools and universities that teach photography too. And we have video training material around Lightroom and Photoshop, and taking professional portraits, covering the business side, actually making money with your photography. So check everything out at our website, NORTHRUP.PHOTO, or go to Amazon and check out the amazing reviews and buy from us with the coupon FALL20 to get 20% off. First, before I go over the cameras, I want to say Nikon's new lens lineup that I saw on Petapixel shows some new lenses coming. It's exciting. The 50mm f1.2 is officially announced, not available yet, but it shows Nikon is going faster, trying to compete with Canon at their high-end lenses, and I think that's really encouraging, even though they're a couple of years behind on these launches. We also expect to see an 85mm. They didn't mention the aperture, but they have an f1.8, so it's either going to be an f1.4 or an f1.2, and I'm thinking it's going to be an f1.2. Why not take Canon on? As well as a 400 and 600mm lens, and I'm guessing, because they were labeled as their high-end S line, that these are going to be fast lenses, so probably f2.8 on the 400mm and f4 on the 600mm to replace their current DSLR lenses, including our own 600 f4. The Nikon Z6 Mark II is $2,000, 24 megapixels, and in many ways identical to the existing Nikon Z6 full-frame mirrorless camera. So this is their sort of mid-range model, above the Nikon Z5 here, but below the Nikon Z7. The Nikon Z7 II has $3,000, has 45 megapixels, and is generally a higher-end camera, though some video users or sports shooters might be happier with the Z6. I'm going to encourage everybody to wait to pre-order. Yes, I could get a few bucks from your affiliate links if you use my links, but I would rather you wait for the full reviews to come out, because nobody has published a real review yet. A few reviewers have done some hands-on stuff, but nobody has given it rigorous testing. We need to know, how accurate is it with something like the 105mm f1.4 if you're shooting headshots? How much does it buffer? How is the video AF? There's a ton of things that really need to be done before anybody sinks thousands of dollars into these. So just give us a little patience until we can get through those tests. In almost every way, these are exactly the same to the Z6 and Z7 that we previously reviewed a couple of years ago. So you can check out those reviews to see things like how they generally handle. They have exactly the same tilting screen, which is really shocking to me in 2020, where a massive portion of buyers are expecting their cameras to serve double duty as a stills camera and as a video camera, where they often need to film themselves. There are far more people right now searching for video cameras for vlogging or teaching or communicating from home than there are people searching for dedicated stills cameras. And it's a weird choice that Nikon would decide to just not approach that sort of content creator market at all in 2020. I know a lot of people are thrilled about the tilt screen. I kind of agree. When I'm shooting just stills, I like it. But at the same time, if you're dropping $2 or $3 grand on a camera, you kind of expect it to do everything. And these people would either have to buy a separate camera to do vlogging or go to a different camera company. They still have sensor stabilization, as did the previous model, so our experience with it is they don't compare to Canon's new sensor stabilization system, which is simply the best. It beats Sony and Fuji and everybody else, period. Now, they're more expensive than the Z6 and Z7 are at their current prices, but they are less expensive than they launched with in 2018. So they're driving the price down, and that's good news. They have the same electronic viewfinder, which is kind of disappointed because it's a 3.6 million dot EVF, which is not very high resolution. Keep in mind, every pixel, red, green, blue, counts as 3 separate dots. So it's basically a 1 megapixel viewfinder. But they are saying that it has lower lag and lower blackout, which will make it better for shooting action. It has an updated battery, even though it's backwards compatible. You can use your old batteries. The new battery has a little bit more charge to it, a little bit more power, and the new battery allows it to run from USB-C power. So the camera can run indefinitely if you're shooting long videos or time lapses, and as well as USB-C charging, with which the previous generation supported as well. Here is the headline news, the thing that's going to drive people to buy these cameras. They have 2 card slots, finally. We thought it was so weird when they launched the original Z6 and Z7 that they marketed them as like replacements for your pro-grade DSLRs. And they gave us like expensive lenses, but they still only gave us 1 card slot. And you're either in the camp where 1 card slot is fine, or you're in the camp with me where if I'm taking a picture, it's important enough that I would want an inexpensive backup by just throwing an SD card in there and just capturing some JPEGs. Another big headline is that they now go from having a single EXPEED processor to 2 EXPEED processors. So they're basically not quite doubling the capacity because there's always some lost overhead there, but they're greatly increasing the ability of it to do things like autofocus, to do any sort of processing. So the whole camera should feel faster. And where I really hope this shows up is in improved autofocus, because even after the firmware updates, that's been a weak spot for Nikon. The frames per second on both cameras is increasing a little bit, but I want you to take this with a grain of salt, because I think the original Nikon Z6 advertised 12 frames per second, but then once we actually started shooting action with telephoto lenses, like real world stuff, we were getting 3 to 4 real world frames per second. So it was coming nowhere near the advertised mark. It was capable of 12 frames per second, but only really if you had it in manual focus just locked off on something, when real world shooting can produce very different values from the stated specs. And this is one of the reasons why you need to wait to buy it, because specs don't tell the whole story. They're advertising now animal IAF and improved human IAF, including when you're using all autofocus points, which makes it really much better for casual shooters who just leave it on all autofocus points. Or even for me, if I'm using like the Canon R5, it's so smart at picking the autofocus point that I actually don't need to use the thumbstick and select an autofocus point. The last time we tested the Z6 and Z7 with the latest firmware updates, I found I still needed to manually select an autofocus point because it kept jumping off to the background. I'd be trying to take a portrait and it would see an eye in a tree and it would shift over there and it would just become confused. And so I decided the whole system just wasn't worth it. I'm hoping now with the 2nd generation that this will work reliably enough, not for casual use, it's okay for casual use, but for like professional use. When you have somebody who's paying you, waiting for you, you don't need to be like, wait, it decided there's an eye in the tree, I need to change it up. I hope we're at this point. And I also hope that it can match the R5's amazing ability to do animal eye autofocus, because with that camera, it can spot a bird in a tree and focus on its eyes before my own vision can pull it out from the complex background. They do offer 10-bit video. That's great news because that's keeping up with the latest generation of cameras from other companies. The bad news is it's only when you're recording to an external recorder. There is this divide in people creating video between those using internal recording and those using external recording. We have 4 or 5 different external recorders, including an Animas Ninja 5, which seems to be the most popular. I hate using them. Even though we're day in and day out recording videos, I refuse to use them because they add extra batteries that can fail, they add extra cables that can come loose, they add all this extra weight and complexity, they reduce discretion when shooting in public places. I hate them. But if you fall into that camp, you can look forward to getting 10-bit video from the external recorder. but you cannot get it from your internal files. The new system is also offering better video autofocus, and I watched Kai Wong's video and it actually looked really good, but we'd like to put it through more rigorous testing to see if perhaps with an external monitor you could actually use it for vlogging or first-person things where you're holding things up to the camera, as well as whether you could use it as, say, a B camera for an interview. You know, if you ever watch an interview on TV, they tend to use 3 cameras, a wide 2-shot showing both people, and then tight shots on each of the individual speakers. And those tight shots will tend to have shallow depth of field and be used with a telephoto lens. And I'm kind of wondering whether you'll be able to use it in that fairly stressful scenario to keep the person's eye in focus, because if you're a documentary filmmaker, that can allow you to shoot an entire scene with 3 cameras and no working cameramen, which is increasingly an important thing, especially in 2020. So can it actually keep up? It's also worth noting they still have a 30-minute recording limit, which is ridiculous because there's no longer a EU tax law that would require that. They should simply unlock it on all cameras, and that applies to Canon too, who also has that artificial limit. For the next section, I want to thank DP Review. They're all my friends over there. I love those guys. They did a lot of research into this, so go check out the full article at that website. Let's talk about the 4K 60 video capabilities, which are really a headline feature for these 2 cameras. They have some serious limitations. On the Z7 Mark II, it has almost full width 4K 60. There's just a little tiny crop that you probably wouldn't even notice, 1.08, but it's line skipped. And that means that it's going to be a little mushier, a little less sharp than the 4K 30, which actually uses all the pixels. This is exactly like the Canon EOS R5, so it's a little hard to be too critical about it. Also, if you look at another competitor, the Sony A7R3 or Sony A7R4, they completely lack 4K 60. So it's easy to complain about the Z7 Mark II's 4K 60 being line skipped, but when none of the competitors have non-line skipped 4K 60, okay, I guess it's now state of the art. The Z6 Mark II has 4K 60, but it's with a 1.5 times crop. This puts it in parallel with the Panasonic S5 that we tested, and as I tried to use it in the real world, I realized, okay, your A-roll is going to be 4K 30. You're going to be publishing at 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second. Okay. The 60 frames per second can be used for sort of dramatic effects and light slow motion while still capturing 4K video. It means you won't be publishing full videos in 60 frames per second, which is our actual preference, because you can never shoot wide angle with 60 frames per second. But for little bits of special effects and slow motion, as long as you're planning it out ahead of time, you can still do that. But you're basically shooting with an APS-C camera at that point, and you could certainly get that for a lot less than $2,000 if you wanted to do that. Also, it's not actually ready yet. This is shocking to me, but Nikon's going to be releasing a firmware update in February of 2021 to give you that 4K 60. So it's a headline feature of the Z6 Mark II, but somehow they didn't get the software ready. And that makes me wonder, like, what's happening at Nikon? Why is it so far behind? How do they have the confidence to know that they'll be able to release it in just a couple of months, but it's not ready yet? Another huge bummer, if you are one of those people using an external field recorder, you can't record 4K 60 at all. Probably a limitation of the HDMI port, but it cannot output 4K 60. It can only output 4K 30 through HDMI. So now we're stuck in this thing where, okay, if you want 10-bit, that's great for people using external recorders, but those people now don't have 4K 60, they only have 4K 30. If you're an internal shooter, you can get 4K 60, but you can't get 10-bit. And in this way, like either way, you're forced to make a compromise. It will also record external raw video. However, this is going to be an additional purchase, a paid upgrade. On the Z6 Mark II, it is line skipped 4K with a little bit of a crop. I don't know exactly how much crop. So that's kind of a bummer, right? The only reason you're recording raw video is that you're willing to put in extra storage, extra processing time because you want the utmost quality, but then you have to drop the quality level by doing it line skipped. If you are shooting with the Z7 Mark II, the raw video is either full width at 1080, dropping down significantly, again, like taking a huge hit to the quality, or shooting 4K with a 1.5 times crop, like basically an APS-C size sensor. So if you do want raw video, in every scenario, you're giving up a significant amount of quality. And why do you want raw video if you're willing to compromise quality? Those things don't go hand in hand. You know, raw video is still a fairly new thing for this category of DSLR style video camera. The A7S Mark III outputs it to an Atomos Ninja 5, though we haven't yet tested that. It's not line skipped or anything. The EOS R5 will do 8K RAW at 30 frames per second, and it's not line skipped. So if you are interested in raw video, there are way better options out there for you. Finally, these cameras are offering a vertical grip. Of course, it's an additional purchase, but it was a very odd oversight for the Z6 and Z7 original cameras that, well, you couldn't get a vertical grip that actually had buttons and dials because there were no electric contacts for it. And everybody looked at it like, what are you guys thinking? Like, people love those vertical grips. They also have bigger buffers, so you'll be able to take, I think, about twice as many shots consecutively for those who are shooting action. And that'll especially help with the higher frame rates. This is something I've been asking everybody for a long time, and that's don't limit single still photos to 30 seconds. It's such an arbitrary limit that you can't shoot more than 30 seconds without then switching to a different mode or using a timed external shutter release. You can now do 15-minute exposures with no external shutter release. You just keep scrolling the dial and it will go to 15 minutes. Thank you, Nikon. You can also do video time lapses. Like, you can fire up the intervalometer and it takes a picture every 5 or 10 seconds. It can make those raw photos, it can make them still photos, but it can also put them into a video file for you, which, especially for content creators who have a quick turnaround and don't want to put all that extra processing time into rendering still photos into a video, it's a convenient thing. I want to say that as we look at the Z6 and Z7 Mark II, I see a lot of reused components. That is discouraging because we have reviewed hundreds of cameras in the last decade, and I've seen several that were mostly remade from used components. But when I think of those at this level of reuse, I'm thinking of the latest Olympus EM1 and the PENTAX K1 Mark II, where they just did minor kind of mostly software-based stuff. They cranked up the processing power a little bit and otherwise identical. And to me, it feels like a technique for releasing a new camera, getting a bunch of sales for people who have to have the latest and greatest without investing a lot in research and development. And that is one of the signs that a company is trailing off, that it's not planning to be number one or fighting for number one, but they are simply managing the decline of the business. And I think that might be what Nikon is doing. I had a lot of high hopes that these were going to wow us. They were going to excite us. They were going to make people want to switch from Sony to Nikon, from Canon to Nikon. That's not the case. I don't think these releases will make anybody switch to Nikon. They'll convince some existing Nikon DSLR shooters to upgrade, but nobody's going to be tempted from any other manufacturer. And so for me, I feel disappointed because I love Nikon, because I want them to succeed, because I won't give up the D850. I still use it with my 600 f4 for wildlife. I still use it with my 105 f1.4 for portraits. Right now, the Nikon DSLRs are really my favorite camera in the world to use, and I wish I could say that about the Nikon mirrorless cameras. There's also no headline feature. There's literally nothing to get excited about. We have seen all these features before, better. And that's why there's just no hype. Here's a comparison on Google Trends of people searching for the Canon R6 and the Nikon Z6 Mark II. And you can see the Z6 is getting only about 9% of the searches that the Canon does. That's comparing their relative peaks. The Z7 Mark II compared to the Canon R5 is even worse. It's only getting about 2% of the searches of the Canon R5. That means people search for the Canon equivalent 50 times more. This is a massive failure on Nikon product management and Nikon marketing. People are not excited about your cameras. Even Nikon predicts falling market share, but this kind of confirms it. People are not getting pumped. It's difficult for me to say people should switch to this camera. You must rush out and buy this. I'm going to compare these two cameras against the closest competitors from Sony, Nikon, Panasonic. But I should say, Nikon doesn't make a proper competitor to their top-end cameras. They do not make a proper competitor to the Canon EOS R5. They do not make a competitor to the Sony A7R4 or the Sony A7S III or the Sony A9. They simply are not competing in those segments. Sony is becoming a value brand. They used to be a technology leader. If you were the type who wanted the latest and greatest, that's why we switched to Nikon from Canon. If that's why you bought into the Nikon system to be part of the bleeding edge, the latest and greatest, then you might be in for some disappointment, because now the technology leaders are Canon and Sony. And Nikon has fair prices. They get the job done for less, but they're a value brand. First, let's compare the Z6 Mark II to the Z7 Mark II in case you're weighing those two. The Z7 Mark II is 50% more at $3,000, but it offers more megapixels. And otherwise, they're going to be almost identical. The bodies are exactly the same. The Z7 Mark II will do about 10 frames per second, but the Z6 Mark II has a higher frames per second. But again, we need to actually test that. They both shoot 4K 60. The Z6 Mark II will do it later with a firmware update, and it will have a 1.5 times crop. The Z7 Mark II does it almost full width, but it's line skipped. So those are the key differentiators. For me, I'm more interested in the Z7 Mark II. If you have an existing Z6 and you're thinking about upgrading, the current Z6 price is about $1,800. The Z6 Mark II is launching at $2,000. We expect those prices of the Z6 to go down, of course. The Z6 Mark II eventually will add cropped 4K 60, but it's not there now. And we're confident the AF is going to be better. So if you're struggling with autofocus, I do believe the Z6 Mark II is going to improve that situation. How much? We'll have to wait until we can actually test it. The frames per second could increase, what you actually see in the real world if you're using the Z6 to shoot action, but again, that needs testing. Maybe most importantly, it is adding a second backup SD card slot. So if your primary XQD fails, then you'll be able to at least not lose your files. And I think the buffering will be about doubled. The closest Canon competitor is the Canon R6, which is significantly more expensive. It's 25% more expensive at $2,500, and it's lower resolution. It's only a 20 megapixel camera. But the R6 offers full width 4K 60 with no line skipping. So that's, for a video shooter, that's going to really beat it. The R6 also has a proper flip forward screen, so you can use it to film yourself, or you can back it into a corner or hold it over your head or hold it vertically. It works in a variety of different situations and generally, in my opinion, makes it superior. The R6 also offers a full 20 frames per second. Real world shooting, we get about 18 frames per second shooting action with continuous autofocus. So that's very high frame rates. And they both have similar electronic viewfinders. Comparing the Nikon Z6 Mark II to the Sony A7 Mark III, which is several years old right now, but still selling at either $1,800 or $2,000. So they're about the same price. They have about the same sensor. The Z6 Mark II adds that cropped 4K 60 mode, which the A7 Mark III lacks, and promises higher frame rates, though again, that needs testing. I'll be honest, the A7 Mark III is really dated right now. When we compared it to the Panasonic S5, we're like, this camera's old and it's showing it. It's just a little bit slow and laggy. So I actually expect the Nikon Z6 Mark II to soundly beat the A7 Mark III, but at the same time, I also expect to see an A7 Mark IV coming soon, and that's probably going to be a better comparison. Let's compare the Nikon Z7 Mark II at $3,000 to the Canon R5 at $3,900. Now, the Canon is 30% more. That's significant difference, but the Canon is also significantly more camera. They both have about the same number of megapixels and will produce similar images, though I would expect the Z7 to have a little bit better dynamic range. I'll say the Canon R5 had better high ISO capabilities than the Sony cameras that I think share the same Z7 sensor. The R5 also offers proper 8K RAW video, which, by the way, records for much longer now than it previously did. We actually find that the 8K RAW video shooting is pretty reliable nowadays, and it shoots at 4K 120, albeit line skipped. The Z7 Mark II only does 4K 60. Like the R6, the R5 has a flip forward screen, which makes it more versatile for both still and video photography, shoots at 20 or real world 18 frames per second, and has a much sharper, more beautiful electronic viewfinder. Not going to change your pictures, but it makes the entire experience more enjoyable. When you use the Canon R5, it's the best camera. It's just like it's the best camera ever made. Let's compare the Nikon Z7 Mark II to my current daily shooter, a Sony A7R Mark IV. I love pixels, and the Sony A7 Mark IV has 60 megapixels, so it's basically unbeat in full-frame cameras. So will you actually see more detail than you would out of a Nikon Z7 Mark II? Probably not. It's mostly going to be dependent on the lens you're using and the atmospheric conditions and stuff, but that combined with pixel shift for people shooting indoors, recreating art, or doing product photography, you can actually produce significantly better looking images with a Sony a7R Mark IV if it's in controlled conditions like that. They both have the same tilty up-down screen, which is disappointing, and they both shoot about 10 frames per second. The Sony a7R Mark IV has a high-resolution, beautiful viewfinder and far more native mirrorless lenses, though with a Nikon you can adapt so many different Nikon DSLR lenses. Like I said earlier, the Sony a7R Mark IV supports a wide variety of third-party lenses, which just opens you up to so many different options. A better comparison is actually the Sony a7R Mark III, the previous generation. Now that sells new for about $2,300. They have about the same number of megapixels. Now, the Sony a7R Mark III does not have 60 frames per second with 4K. So if you needed 60 frames per second, you would have to drop down to 1080. The Z7 does it, but with line skip to 4K. They both offer 2 card slots, but the Z7 Mark II offers a faster XQD card. So a little buffering can be a problem on the Sony a7R Mark III, and it's not likely to be a problem on the Z7 Mark II. So this is they're actually very, very similar, but the Z7 Mark II is now $700 more expensive. So as they compare side by side, I had to ask myself, like, who are these cameras for? If you're a hybrid shooter, I would probably be recommending a Panasonic S5 for $2,000. That's an awesome camera. Or if you have more budget, the R6 or the Canon R5 are overall just like the best cameras currently made. If you're a stills shooter looking for the ultimate in image quality, the Sony a7R Mark III at $2,300 can't be beat. Or you know what? A Canon 5DSR DSLR, you can pick it up used at KEH for an incredibly low price, and I still have mine. It produces amazing images. Or I would recommend my current daily shooter, a Sony a7R Mark IV, for higher megapixel, 60 megapixel still images or 240 megapixel pixel shift images. If you're looking for a vlogging camera, neither of these Nikon cameras will suit you because they don't have a flip forward screen. Instead, I'd push you towards a Canon RP, a Canon R, a Canon R6, or my vlogging camera, the Sony a7S Mark III. And if you're a dedicated video shooter, like you're the cameraman, you're never in front of the camera, you're always behind the camera, Panasonic kind of owns this space with the S5 and the S1H, but the Canon R6 and R5 and Sony a7S Mark III are also just like amazing contenders in this space. So as I break down the different buying segments, I don't end up actually thinking that these are the best for any of them. And it makes me ask, who are these cameras actually for? And the answer is they're for Nikon loyalists. People perhaps like you who've invested in Nikon gear. Perhaps you hold a fondness for the brand. Now you can upgrade to a full-frame mirrorless camera. You can adapt all your Nikon lenses. You can get that Nikon user interface and ergonomics that you already love. And you can have 2 card slots and you can have excellent video capabilities. But if you don't yet own a camera, should you jump into one of these 2 models? Probably not. But it does offer a great upgrade path for committed Nikon shooters. If you are upgrading and you want to sell your old gear, I sell all my stuff through KEH. And if you watched our Stolen Camera Gear podcast yesterday, you find out that there's actually a lot of risk to trying to sell your own stuff. So you can go to sdp.io/KEH to sell your stuff there, or buy used gear at a good price and use the coupon code TNC20 for 5% off. I just looked, and you can pick up an amazing full-frame Nikon D750 DSLR for $900 there. And that comes with KEH's 14-day warranty and like 180-day fix-it period. Where something breaks, they'll fix it. I'm tired. My vocabulary is running out. Time to hear from you in the comments down below. Let me know if you're considering buying one of these cameras. And if not, what did you want them to be? Like, what would it take for you to buy into a Nikon camera? Will they ever ship, or is Nikon going to run into the same supply chain problems that have been keeping like the 70-200 f2.8 from actually shipping? And will these cameras be enough to save Nikon, or is Nikon just resigning themselves to squeaking out a little extra profit from their existing customer base while gradually exiting the industry? I don't know the answer to it. One more time, I want to plug our own stuff, educational materials. Learn photography, learn Photoshop, learn Lightroom, and do it all for 20% off with the coupon code FALL20 at NORTHRUP.PHOTO, as well as just update your wardrobe, get these cool Aperture hats. You know why I like the Aperture hat? If I wear a sports team hat, people come up to me and they're like, oh, you like the Red Sox? Did you see the game last night? And the answer is, no, I didn't see the game last night. I don't follow sports or really care about it. Instead, I like photography. So it's like, this is me saying, this is my team: photography, video, I just love creating visual content. And of course, this shirt makes me just look, it's just an awesome, comfortable t-shirt. So get the latest in photography apparel at NORTHRUP.PHOTO. Thanks and bye.